One of the big complaints you'll hear about cities is there are just too many unhoused people. In fact, I think you'd find near unanimity that homelessness is an actual problem, but it's also a problem where there's a lot of disagreement about the root causes and the solutions. So, today's video is my attempt to inject some data and objective reality into the discourse and to try to get us all as close to being on the same page as possible. Let's start with some basics. The number of unhoused people in the US varies over the course of a year, but the Department of Housing and Urban Development does an annual point in time count, and in 2024, they counted 771,480 people, which was up 18% from the previous year, so this is not trending in a good direction. Now, that number is only 0.2% of this country's population, but it has huge impacts on our politics and our municipal budgets. In fact, in a lot of cities, if you ask people what their number one concern is, it's homelessness. And maybe housing affordability is a close second. Wouldn't it be amazing if those two things were related? Now, people's concerns about homelessness can come in a lot of flavors. Some of it's basic human empathy, some of it is maybe chambers of commerce that are worried about visiting suburbanites and convention goers. But there are also a lot of real spillover effects. Homelessness is expensive, it stresses the city's systems, public safety, criminal justice, healthcare, emergency services. So there's a huge personal cost that hundreds of thousands of unhoused people bear every day, and there are huge secondary costs that are borne by society as a whole. Before we get too far, some clarification on terminology. When you think of homelessness, you might think of panhandlers or tent camps under a freeway overpass, but that's not what most homelessness in the US looks like. To understand the issue, you really need to differentiate between homelessness, which is a broader term that includes all people who lack stable, permanent housing, and being unsheltered, which means you live outside or in a car or like an abandoned building. The distinction is important. If you visit a major city in California, the homelessness is much more visually apparent than it is if you visit a major city on the East Coast. So what might surprise you is the state of New York has a higher homelessness rate than the state of California. But the reason it feels different is in New York, like a lot of northeastern states, the vast majority of those people are sheltered. Only 3.6% of the unhoused population is unsheltered. Compare that to California, where a full 2/3 of the unhoused population is unsheltered. Different policy approaches. Cities that have winter weather that's a serious mortality risk invest much more in shelter systems than cities that tend to have moderate weather all year long. Okay, so that's the baseline I want to start us with today. Homelessness is something that, on any given day, directly affects just a fraction of a percent of the population, but with vast secondary impacts. It's an issue people have strong feelings about, and the way it presents itself varies greatly from city to city. So now let's get into the why. Popular narratives often characterize homelessness as a personal failing. Like, if people would just stop making bad life choices, then homelessness would be solved. Or that homelessness is really about substance abuse and mental illness. But the data say the majority of unhoused people don't have these conditions, and a vast majority of people who do have these conditions never lose their housing. The reality is, unhoused people are often the working poor, barely making ends meet on their living expenses, and incredibly vulnerable to any kind of unexpected change in their circumstances. Now, the mechanics of how homelessness plays out are going to vary from city to city, and there are a lot of variables. Tax incentives, minimum wage laws, rental subsidies, eviction protections. Those things aren't really this channel's wheelhouse, but something that is, which I'm going to argue is right at the very heart of this nation's homelessness crisis, is housing affordability. So let's frame things like this. Why is homelessness not only more apparent, but much more prevalent in superstar coastal cities? You'll see this just about any way you slice the data, but to put it simply, the New York and LA metro areas combined account for just under 10% of America's overall population, but together they account for over a quarter of the nation's unhoused population. And the analysis of what it actually is that accounts for the huge variation in homelessness rates across regions in this country is the basis for this book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Colburn and Aldern. More on that later, but the way they structure the argument is to do statistical analyses to test the impact of different intuitive seeming factors on regional homelessness rates. They test individual factors like rates of serious mental illness and rates of substance abuse disorder and find almost no correlation. Maybe more surprisingly, they test unemployment and poverty rates, also very low correlation. Surprising, but think of it this way. Among large metro areas, Detroit and Cleveland have very high poverty rates, but homelessness is relatively low because depopulation in those regions has made housing relatively cheap and abundant. Maybe not the abundance agenda you were hoping for, but it points to a key insight. In cities with lots of housing inventory, there are usually less expensive options available if you have a bad turn of luck. But in cities with expensive rents in a tight housing market, the next rung down, if you're already on the edge and a triggering event happens, is you don't get to have a roof over your head. So the one independent variable they tested that had by far the most explanatory power for homelessness rates was just prevailing rents. It's ironic. The things that are considered markers of a successful city, a robust economy, high wages, and high demand for housing, are also the things that create a perfect storm for homelessness. Think of it this way, it's musical chairs, except the chairs are housing units, and a person's ability to secure a chair is determined by not just their income, but a complex set of individual risk factors like domestic abuse, chronic medical conditions, and immigration status. Musical chairs is just a metaphor, so here's some actual data from a 2025 National Low Income Housing Coalition report based on the most recent US Census data. There are 45.6 million renter households in the US and 47.6 million viable rental units, which we know are not uniformly distributed across the US. 10.9 million of these renter households are at the extremely low income level, meaning they're at 30% of area median income or lower, but there are only 3.8 million rental units that are affordable at that level, where affordability is defined as spending 30% or less of your income on housing. Worse, they have to compete with households that are at 30 to 50% AMI, an income level at which there is also a shortage of affordable units. And in reality, they even have to compete with renters in higher income brackets who simply want to spend a lower percentage of their income on rent. The headline number here is the US is short 7.1 million affordable rental units just for the households at or below 30% AMI. But to me, the problem goes a lot deeper. What we have right now is an economic system that creates an extremely wide variance in income and wealth, but a housing market that is market-driven and doesn't reflect the same wide variance. Here's what I mean. If I take a city like Los Angeles, I can split out household incomes into 4 categories. Those making 50% AMI or less, those making between 50% and the median, those making between the median and double the median, and those making more than double. And you get a somewhat even distribution over the 4 categories. Well, if I take my rental data from Dwellzy and split the available rentals into 4 similar categories, I don't get anything like the same kind of distribution. In fact, only 3 of the roughly 4,000 units in the data set were under 50% of the median per square foot price. Now, this is a little apples to oranges because I'm comparing the universe of renters to the universe of households, and a lot of the higher income households are probably not competing for rentals, but this is still pretty bleak. So one reasonable question you might ask at this point is, why are we like this? We live in an era of unparalleled wealth and prosperity, but increasingly that newly accrued wealth is going to a very tiny sliver of the populace. Meanwhile, the housing market is proving to be increasingly inelastic, especially in our high-demand coastal cities, meaning the supply of new housing is relatively non-responsive to demand. Why? Well, one popular idea is that coastal cities have more restrictive regulatory environments, and there is some truth to that, but consider this paper by Albert Saiz, which finds that housing supply elasticity is a function of not just regulatory constraints, but geographic constraints. And this is largely why landlocked, high growth metro areas like Charlotte, Atlanta, and Dallas Fort Worth have housing markets that are much more elastic and responsive. They literally have more places they can grow, and they have much lower rates of homelessness. Okay, still to come, a bit more on regional variation, including whether unhoused people literally migrate to warm weather cities with liberal policies, because that is an argument that you will hear. Still coming to Lexington, Kentucky on March 3rd, tickets evaporating quickly, I'm told. And to New York on April 24th, ticketing is still in the works, but I will do a 1 week pre-sale on my Patreon, so look there first. Okay, so I did pull from a lot of different sources for this video, but the basic animating idea does come from this book. It's right up my alley. They use the same kinds of data sources I use all the time, but much more robust statistical analysis than I do. They really drill down into the systemic causes of homelessness, and it's very well written and very convincing. I think it's a really important book that everybody who cares about cities and people should read. Link down in the description. Okay, let's talk a bit about solutions and the politics around them. There's some support in the research for the idea that investments in things like shelter and permanent supportive housing create incentives for people to use those services at higher rates for longer periods of time. So, in other words, you're not just solving the problem you set out to solve, but you're revealing a new segment of the population that was on the edge of using services and gets tipped over into using them by the increased supply you're offering. This type of dynamic is really just par for the course, though. Policies never get implemented in a vacuum. There are always spillover effects and moral hazard and deadweight loss. You might even call this induced demand, which doesn't by itself make it a bad policy. I mean, helping more people than you originally intended to help doesn't seem like a terrible outcome. Related, you'll sometimes hear that liberal policies regarding homeless services will induce more poor people to come to your city and consume those services. Colburn and Aldern analyzed this and found basically no relationship between interregional migration and homelessness rates. However, there is evidence that within a metro area, people facing housing insecurity will sometimes move to the city that has the services they need. And it does often seem it's the core city of a metro area that all the suburbs lean on to provide those services. Let's talk solutions. Section 8 housing voucher programs, if you're not familiar. This is for households making 50% of AMI or less, and it covers housing costs that are in excess of 30 or 40% of those households' income. They're good programs in a market context, but as we already talked about, the regions where we have the most housing supply issues are also the ones where the market is the most inelastic. Just take Seattle as an example. In 2020, a McKinsey analysis found that King County was short 37,000 units that would be needed to house the portion of the county's 96,000 extremely low-income households that are either unhoused or renting but housing cost burdened, meaning they're rapidly falling behind and sliding toward economic disaster. McKinsey estimated the cost of providing this housing at $11 billion, which is a lot of money, but this is also a region that said yes to $54 billion for a transit measure. So part of this is a question of how you view that $11 billion. And there are a lot of ways to view it uncharitably, but I would encourage you to consider the other side of the ledger. How much your local government could potentially save on policing, the court system, public health, emergency services, and all the other resources we throw at this problem under current conditions. By the way, the McKinsey data was from 2017. My quick look at 2024 ACS data says 13% of county households are now at 30% AMI or less, or about 128,000. So I think it's a pretty good bet the number of ELI households is growing faster than we're building affordable housing. One more thing on this, there's a great paper out of Australia, Cost Offsets of Supportive Housing, Evidence for Social Work by Parcell, Peterson, and Culhane, that analyzes the efficacy of supportive housing in detail, and it found that in 12 months when people are unhoused, they consume 48,000 Aussie bucks of combined public services of all kinds, but as tenants in supportive housing, they consume just 35,000, including the cost of the housing. So I can't emphasize enough that homelessness is an issue that you really have to consider very holistically. Here are 6 words I want to leave you with. The solution to homelessness is housing. They're 6 words that are so obvious that they seem almost nonsensical, but the disconcerting feeling you get when you hear those words isn't because they're nonsense. It's because they're so transparently true, yet it feels like we've barely acted on the idea at all. Here are some of Colburn and Aldrin's closing words. People design cities and structure markets. They can also choose to change them. Or a way I might put it is, cities don't spontaneously appear and then remain static as if trapped in amber. And predatory capitalism is not the divinely ordained way of the world. Housing should be a human right, and as a country, we're more than rich enough to make good on that. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for your direct support, which lets me get out of my comfort zone occasionally and talk about things that I just think absolutely have to be talked about. Thanks to the Nebula subscribers too, the support means a ton. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.